Yeah, thanks for joining me, Joomi, to talk about um, the state of making sense of the world. You had a piece a while ago in your Substack that got me really interested in talking to you about that, which was kind of the parallels of the Iraq war propaganda and the kinds of narratives that we're seeing right now, which kind of meshes in with a lot of the themes we've been covering on Fresh Lens. But maybe before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into writing your Substack publication?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm from New York, and I did a PhD at Rutgers University where I did research on manipulating algae to make lipids for biodiesel. And then I worked in tech for a while, for a few years, and then I joined Alessandro's Marinos' startup, Good Loops, recently. And I just got into the Substack because there were some things about the COVID pandemic and the vaccines in particular uh, that just weren't making sense to me. And I just did some fact checks about some things, and especially about the spike protein. I just saw, there's all these articles and fact check articles saying that the spike protein is not harmful. It's safe and all these things, and that's just not true. There's like peer reviewed literature, showing all kinds of evidence that it's harmful. And I couldn't believe that more people didn't know about this, so I just started writing about it. Yeah.
Right. Um, and I guess if to kind of like pull on that thread a little bit, why did you think that? I mean, what was it that gave you confidence that what you were finding out on your own was more correct than kind of the mainstream narrative that was out there?
Well, for one thing, it's not like I was the only one saying this, right? So, like, I heard Robert Malone say this on the Dark Horse podcast. I mean, it would feel strange if I were truly the only person thinking this, but it was also just like I said. It was in. Uh, there's like a bunch of articles, a bunch of studies on it,
Right.
and there are some studies where, like, maybe you need to be within that particular field in order to interpret it. But, a lot of these were like, where almost anyone can see that there's something that, like, there was one, for example, where they gave mice some pseudo virus, like it was just like a sort of a fake virus with like just spike protein on the surface, and then like they had I think they were hamsters maybe, they had them breathe them in, and there were just like clearly physiological things happening with the mice, right? So it's not like you need to be some kind of an expert to be like, okay, that doesn't look good,
Right.
so it's not like, yeah. um and just the fact that there were multiple studies as well, like if it were one, maybe it'd be like, okay, maybe that's not a big deal. So it was like, it's multiple pieces of evidence, multiple studies, and then also people who are also experts, saying this, and then also seeing them get censored. It's like, okay, what's going on?
Right.
So yeah.
And so, with the research that you've done so far, like, what do you think is going on at this point?
Good question. I don't know. There are certain things I'm more confident in, and there are other things where, like, I set the probability as, like, I don't know, 50-50, right? So things I'm confident in, right, is that okay, I think censorship is definitely happening, right? Censorship of dissident scientists or people who talk about, vaccine safety and things like that. I think that there's enough evidence from all over the place that the COVID vaccines are not as safe as our officials tell us. But I don't know what the true rate of adverse events are. I'm not as certain about that, right?
Right.
So, and then when it comes to bigger picture things, like how intentional is this, or do the pharma execs know that they are harming more people than, what the officials say? Like, it's really hard to say. My guess would be yes, but like, I'm less sure about these things. I don't know these people. Even if I knew them. It's like sometimes you don't really know people, even if you think you know them. So there's different layers of certainty, but what I am certain of are like these things that I've seen in these studies that are like don't leave so much open to interpretation, honestly, and the fact that there's like multiple types of evidence pointing to that, like to things not being safe. um
So
yeah.
I would say I think anyone who listens to the podcast knows that I'm definitely biased to agree with you, but I'll play a bit of a devil's advocate because I've had these conversations with other people that talk about, like doing your own research is something that in some circles is actually looked upon as a foolish thing to be trying to do. So the kind of the comment that you will hear is, hey, you've got all these experts who are telling you one thing. Who are you to go and like decide that you can make sense of this information better? Like, sure, maybe you can cherry pick a few studies here and there, but there are all these doctors from around the world, all these health authorities who are telling you you should be taking the vaccines and they're safe and effective. Um, why do you get to go against that? Isn't that the Dunning Kruger effect, where you're not an expert and you think that you are qualified to comment on this area?
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, I'm so tired of hearing about the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Actually, one of the best
Yeah,
things I've
but
discovered about the Dunning Kruger effect is that the popular conception of it is actually completely detached from what the study actually showed. But that's a separate conversation.
okay, yeah, I'd like to hear about that. But no, anyway, I'm a big believer in doing your own research. By the way, it's not that I don't think that things can go awry when you go outside of a field that you don't know a lot about. In, of course, they can. But it's also just completely false that experts don't get it wrong, right? There's just many times in history where like the majority of experts got it wrong, and also in this case, we have experts who are dissenting from the sort of mainstream view. So it's not like there aren't any out there, right? Like I would be questioning myself more if there weren't, other like very smart people who were saying like similar things. But the other thing I'll say is, yeah, this thing about don't do your own research. This is such a huge pet peeve of mine. It just encourages this like passivity, and it honestly puts just like I said before, it just puts too much trust in experts as if they're infallible or not susceptible to groupthink. Um, like not just groupthink, but also there's careerism and there's corruption too, But like even putting that aside, there like I've seen it myself, like within scientists where there's like this groupthink and they just can't think outside of like a really narrow sort of vision, And I mean, one thing I know for certain is that like biology is definitely much more complicated than like these cartoons we get shown on like the CDC websites, about how the mRNA vaccines work. And um, by the way, I took the vaccines, I took 2 doses of Moderna. So this was before like I was really like aware of much of this. And I regret it now that I know more about the vaccines. But looking back, I just like kick myself because I'm like, I should have known better. Like that there were some things about this that seemed like really simplistic, like when it comes to immunology and all these other things. But yeah, it's like if you just look at history, there's just been so many times when like experts were wrong or like we just thought something was simpler in biology and it wasn't,
Yeah.
So like, why why is it so surprising that it could be different this time?
I think one of the things that definitely helped me, it primed me for being willing to be take a more critical look here is was having worked in a really large corporation for the first time in my life. So I spent most of my life working in small startups or just being fully
Hmm.
independent. And then I went to a big corporation and I saw how the bureaucracy functions. We actually talked about this in the context of bullshit jobs on the podcast. where like you start talking about the corporation as a machine, and you know that like there are certain things you're supposed to do to play the game that everyone's playing in that environment, but nobody's even in charge of it. Everybody did you meet is supposed to be playing the same game, and they're playing it just as helplessly as you. It doesn't matter if they're your boss or they're your direct reports. They're just as helpless in like navigating the machine as you are. Um, and so, like seeing that kind of environment is one of the things that I think primed me psychologically. And I think if this had happened like 3 or 4 years ago, before I had that experience, I would have said like, no, no, like the experts are fine. Like we got to listen to them, and I wouldn't be. I wouldn't know all the ways in which really smart people can do really stupid things because of the
Hmm.
incentive structure that they're in. And then like over the last couple of months when I've looked into this, it's like, yeah, the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry is just like it's a one career ladder. Right? It's like this is like a
I
old
know.
news that they're constantly rotating. The same people are rotating through the FDA and then like going to
Yeah.
the pharma industry. And this was something that was like very, the progressive leaning people in society were
It was
very
common
keen to
knowledge.
highlight.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's common knowledge. Yeah. But somehow now it's become verboten
Yeah.
to bring that up.
Well, it's like people forgot that.
Yeah.
But what you mentioned in corporations, I mean, there's a bit of that in academia too. I don't know.
Right.
People seem to think that academic scientists, like, they have a very high view of them. And I'm not saying that some of them don't deserve that, and by no means am I saying that all of them are corrupt or all these things. But yeah, the incentives are not necessarily aligned to find the truth. And there's a lot of pressure to publish. And, like, if you were an academic and you wanted to publish something that was, showing that some vaccine was not safe, like, it's bad for your career,
Right.
so um, yeah, how is that going to be conducive to, finding out the truth? So
Yeah. Yeah, I also took two shots of the Moderna before I started getting into all of this, but I think my skepticism was starting to build before I got my second dose, and I think by purely by chance, I dosed them so far apart that that I end up. I was looking at some of the studies from out of Ontario, and I think like the cases of some of the side effects, like myocarditis, seem to go down the longer you space out the doses. So I think I accidentally
yeah.
got lucky on that front. But I at the time it was like being able to travel was really important to me. So I was like, I know there's probably more risk than they're telling us, but I'm gonna take it anyway because I
Hmm.
need to travel.
you,
Um,
you know the only reason I took it, right, well, like, I had reservations about it, but I thought that it prevented
Infection.
infection, and I didn't want
You
to get
hadn't updated your
yeah.
dictionary. That was so 2019.
Yeah, I thought that you could get infected, and, like, I never thought that, like, I would be at risk of, like, dying from COVID or some bad outcome just because, like, my age and all these things. But I had heard about long COVID. I do
Right.
think it's a real thing. I don't think it's, like, high incidence, but, like, that was a thing that I, like, didn't wanna get. So I was thinking about long COVID. That was the only
Right.
reason I got it. But turns out, like, there's no real evidence that it, like, helps prevent that either. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was. I'm a techno optimist, I would say, and I was very happy that these vaccines were coming out. People were saying, I think I heard people talk about the fact that like, hey, these things are being developed in record time. Are they cutting corners in terms of safety trials and stuff like that? And in my mind, it was like, no, technology has advanced. It's awesome, and I'm going to be one of the first people to like line up and get it, and then the pandemic's going to be over. So that turned out not to be the case. That then the breaking point for me was exactly the point where in British Columbia, where I live, we had 87% of the population had gotten their first dose of the eligible population back in August of 2021, and then the health authorities started coming out with more and more draconian measures, after having told everyone for months that vaccination is our way out of this. And I was like, really? Like, so
Hmm.
you're telling me that that 13% that didn't get their first dose, that are holdouts, they are causing such an issue that we need to go back into lockdowns. We need to introduce vaccine passports. Um, we need to implement all these things that we didn't implement before, uh, even with 90% vaccine uptake. So that was the point where I started looking into it. I was like, well, wait a minute, these are not vaccines. These are. It's actually part of the reason. This is the whole narrative of a pandemic of the unvaccinated was just so evil in my mind that it was just totally not true. That was just vilifying a certain portion of the population, who I now view as a bit of a societal immune function. I think a lot of the people who are like skeptical of authority, they're not always right factually, but they are serving a good function in society now.
I agree. I agree. Yeah.
So let's get to the piece that uh, that really prompted me wanting to talk to you. So I think you and I are both on the same page that things have stopped making sense over the last year. And the more you see these people in positions of authority, like in public health, who are doing these things that it doesn't make sense. I don't know what incentive exactly they're pursuing, or I don't know what political environments exactly they're or political forces they're exactly operating under, but I do know that the effect of what they're saying and doing is that it's unethical to the very least. To me, that all these impositions on people's lives were highly unethical for something that there's very little evidence that it would help anybody. um, but you wrote this piece about the parallels today with the propaganda that we were experiencing in the lead up to the war in Iraq. And it really tied into the epistemic uncertainty that we're under. Like at this point, when I hear something from a public official, it doesn't matter if it's about public health or otherwise, especially if it's about public health, but it could be about anything. My level of skepticism has skyrocketed, right? But at the same time, I'm not ready to believe 9/11 was an inside job. There's a lot of um, there's a lot of possibilities that get put on the table once you're willing to entertain certain notions. I think a lot of my defense mechanisms against conspiracy theories in the past was some was rooted in some level of trust in Western governments that is increasingly eroded. So
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, I don't actually have a specific question here. Let's maybe talk about that, like the parallels that you saw in like how the public narrative is shaping today with the way it was happening under in the lead up to the war in Iraq. And I'm kind of curious to hear about how you're navigating things um, today, and today, like in the early 2000s, we just had like 9/11 and the war in Iraq, and that was like the thing for like 10 years. Today we have like a new thing every month that that everyone's fired up about, so it's very hard to drink from that fire hose.
Yeah. I mean, when I was doing research for that article, it really struck me that. So first of all, before I started looking into that at all, like writing that article, I had the impression, and I think a lot of people do, that um, like most people saw the war in Iraq as just this mistake that we made and we bungled through it, and that like Bush and company had more or less the right intentions, and then some people think, okay, no, it was actually about oil, you know, and all this talk about spreading democracy and you know was maybe an excuse. So some people think that much, right? But a lot of people thought like that Bush believed that there were WMDs, right, in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein had them, But uh, then I learned only recently when I was doing research for this article that there are all these like leaks that show that all these officials, like in not just the U.S. but the UK, like Blair's administration, that they knew that they were like making stuff up, about these WMDs. And I was pretty surprised to learn this because like I hadn't heard about this. I hadn't heard about these leaks, and these seem like bombshells, right? I specifically remember some of the leaks where somebody was saying like they were talking about like the way to phrase to the public, about these WMDs, to like kind of fool them, and then they were saying something like, I understand that this isn't going to, fool an expert. I forget exactly how they put it, but this is not for them, it's not going to hoodwink an expert. It's not for them. It's for just like the type of person who has the news is kind of humming along in the background, So it was more or less that's what they said. Anyway, this was pretty shocking when I like heard about this, and I was like shocked that more people hadn't heard about this. None of my friends knew about this, in the states. It just got me thinking that like um, at the time there were all these dissidents who were saying something right from the very beginning that something wasn't right about this whole WMD story, but Bush and Cheney were selling us, and they were getting censored, just like what we've seen happen recently, not just with COVID, but with Ukraine. I mean, lots of other things too, I'm sure. So there were parallels there. But then I also remember, I think from some of the leaks, they were talking about how there was, or maybe I think it was Matt Taibbi. He wrote some article about how one way in which you kind of can fool the public is that you just kind of drown them out in all these like technical details, and the result, like within the news articles about WMDs, there are all these like technical sounding things about aluminum tubes and things like that with WMDs, and like people, it just glazes over, people just don't really understand it, and they just stop caring after a while, and I do feel like again that happens with like COVID as well. Like there's just people can't keep up with all the technical stuff. But yeah, I mean, just the parallels are just that like there are just so many parallels. There's dissidents who were censored, people. There were leaks that should have been bombshells, but like not everybody heard about, right? Which, by the way, doesn't bode well for like whether there's going to be some kind of big reckoning when it comes to like COVID. Um, like in the future, are people going to see Fauci as a bad guy? I don't know, because not everybody sees Bush as a bad guy now. They think that he just made mistakes. Okay.
Yeah, it's so interesting because
Uh,
I think at the time they definitely saw Bush was seen as a horrible president at the time, and there was a lot of hatred towards him. Um, Probably only surpassed by the hatred that Trump um, received. Um, but it's funny that now he has this
yeah.
like kind of a figure of like an old grandpa that's like just painting and kind of like this lovable
Yes.
character. I'm actually curious, these leaks that you're talking about, when did they come out? Did they come out in the 2000s, like during the Bush presidency, or was it like long, years and years afterwards?
Oh, I don't remember now. I think it was years after, but there was one was called the Downing Street Memo, and the other was the Chilcot Report. I don't know. I'd have to look it up because I can't remember now. It's been a while.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I think it was later, and that's part of maybe what it was. Like people just didn't care anymore, maybe. Um, Yeah, and by the way, what you're talking about George W. Bush's, sort of reputation revival. I mean, we've seen similar things happen with a lot of these sort of neocons, like a lot of them who are all for the war in Iraq. They, I don't know. It just seems like a lot of Democrats have now embraced them, like because all they had to do was to say that they hate Trump, and then like the
Right.
Democrats now love them.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they're neocons. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's
Oh,
crazy that I think
2016. Yeah, it was the Chilcot Report.
2016. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's like the worst time for
Yeah.
for a report like that to come out, because everyone's whipped up in a frenzy about Trump probably, and no one cares about the war in Iraq anymore. But it is pretty crazy that
Yeah.
there is absolutely no feedback loop to these things. So if you're a public official it's only like you just have to be able to keep this quiet for a certain number of years until people just stop caring. And I think at some point the answer is like, well, what are we going to do? Prosecute a president over a war in the Middle East?
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, people are just. I mean, I don't blame them to a certain extent, right? It's just there's an overwhelming amount of information, and then people just stop keeping track of it. But it's also like it's the media. It's like this is the type of thing that should have been on like front pages of the New York Times and all these things, and that's how people would find out. But it wasn't. You know.
So this is a total aside, but I was actually just talking about this with a couple of friends of mine. Have you heard about the Hunter Biden iCloud hack recently?
Wait, was that the 4chan hack,
Yeah,
or is that a separate thing?
I think it was a
Okay,
4chan
yeah, a little
hack.
bit, yeah.
So it's this
Okay,
guy loves doing crack and on all sorts of things and just filming himself while doing it. It's just he loves filming himself doing all sorts of
yeah,
things. But what was
yeah.
interesting was a few days ago, I read this article in some mainstream publication about this, and they basically the only thing that they mentioned was in communications with Hunter, Joe Biden used the pseudonym from a Tom Clancy novel, and I think the pseudonym was something like Peter Henderson or something like that. Um, and then I watched a video by JP Sears, who actually like goes through some of the Hunter Biden videos from the hack, and like some of the screenshots from his messages and whatnot. And it is true that Joe Biden is going by the name Peter Henderson, but in Hunter's contacts, he's listed as Pedo Pete, which I thought was an interesting detail
I
for them
heard
to
this.
gloss over.
Yeah, I just didn't know what to make of this, honestly. I mean, so are we sure that that refers to his father, Joe Biden?
Yes, I'm pretty sure. Like it's only it's in group chats with it's Hunter, Pedo Pete, and Jill Biden. And yeah, it's they're
That's
just having a
disturbing.
family conversation. So like
Hmm. Hmm.
if you want
Yeah,
fuel
interesting
for
blending.
conspiracy theories, there's all these crazy ideas out there that like I this is what I'm saying. I just can't have when I hear someone say something that seems totally out there, I just can't dismiss it anymore. I don't have the tools to do it. So you hear about these like the Democrat pedophile ring allegations, and who knows, I'm sure there's some like QAnon version of this that is completely insane. But I also wonder if every one of these conspiracy theories is like taking what is like a grain of truth and building a whole narrative around it, partly because there is nothing else to go on, right? You kind of like you pick up some signal and you don't exactly know what the signal is telling you. So you do what humans do best, which is like build an entire narrative around that signal that you're picking up. But it doesn't mean that the conspiracy theories don't doesn't mean that conspiracy theories are true, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a kernel of truth in them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the whole Epstein thing, right? I mean, so that was a kernel of truth, you know. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that much about other conspiracy theories. I just haven't had time to look into them, honestly. But
Yeah,
like, I feel like you have to be open minded because, like, after the crazy stuff that we've seen, like, yeah, that I want to say I wouldn't be surprised if some crazy stuff turns out true, but I still end up surprised anyway. But yeah,
right. So how are you kind of navigating things right now? So let's say the new thing. So we have a new thing every month or so. Let's it's the cycles like the frequencies ratcheting up. So we had when COVID lasted a long time. It was a good 2 years of COVID. In between, we had the BLM riots, um, and then we had the January 6th and all sorts of other things. But COVID lasted for a good 2 years. But then I think Putin basically ended COVID by invading Ukraine, and I think now maybe inflation is ending Ukraine. I'm not sure, but so we constantly have these new things that people get whipped up into a frenzy about. So what's kind of your thought process when the next thing comes up? So let's say when the Ukraine crisis happened, or the Ukrainian invasion happened, how are you kind of navigating the information that's coming out and taking a stance on it, or are you just not taking a stance on it?
Um, yeah, okay. What I will say about Ukraine is like I don't know as I don't feel as confident in it.
I mean, it can be any example.
As, yeah, or it, that goes for like most of the things. I'm not as confident about it if I haven't looked into it that deeply. What I will say is just I'm skeptical of all kinds of narratives I'm seeing, and it just is. It doesn't even take that much like digging to see that there are things that are wrong. Like when you just look at how media narratives, about Ukraine were before the war and then after. There's like clearly like discrepancies there, right? Um, how there was like corruption and all these things before, and then like now it's like I don't know, it's like a completely different way that they're portraying things. But it's harder for me to have like firmer sort of beliefs in any of that, just because I feel like it's largely a matter of who to believe, you know. Um, and what I will say is that there are people who, okay, like for example, when it came to the Iraq War, right, there's some people who are from the beginning, very skeptical of a narrative. Like one example was this ex CIA person, Ray McGovern, right? And what he said, about Iraq turned out to be right. That all that WMD stuff was bullshit. And so let's just say I trust what he says more about geopolitical things, than whatever Brian Stelter or something. Okay, but you never know though, right? You can't just say, okay, because this person was right about this, he's going to be right about this other thing. So yeah, I'm just less certain when it comes to like geopolitical things or things that are I don't know, that I just haven't looked into as much. Like I looked into the Ukraine thing a little bit, but yeah, again, even if you're there in Ukraine, right, it doesn't mean that you understand what's going on.
Yeah.
There's people who are like, oh, I went, like these. Uh, um, I think you saw. I think you're aware of that All In podcast with what was it was with
Antonio Garcia Martinez. Yeah.
yeah, him and Glenn Greenwald and Martinez. What had been in Ukraine for I don't know how long, maybe like a few months. He didn't say. Maybe it could have been weeks. And then he kind of felt like okay, he knew something about it then, but it's like, no, I mean, you could live your entire life in a country and not understand what's really going on behind the scenes, in like the real power in the country. You don't know who's really controlling things.
Yeah.
So like, how can I know? I don't even fully understand what's going on in my own country. But what you can do is just look at history. Okay. Like, and how we've been lied to before, right? And how the US has a history of lying about interventions, and it's not usually for good reasons, honestly. I mean, maybe sometimes, but when we end up spending a lot of money on something, I don't think it's just because we care about democracy, because we just look at the history. So all I can say is that I don't trust the narrative, but I don't know more specific beyond that, and I don't know that I ever will, honestly.
Yeah. I think the part where it becomes difficult is, there could be a crisis going on. I actually think there is a crisis going on probably right now in China, where let's say there was some kind of a genocide going on, and let's say if it wasn't in China and it was somewhere else, we might have the power to stop it. Um, in the ideal world, we would want to do everything that we can to stop an atrocity like that from taking place. But we also live in this environment of polluted information where we don't actually know, is there actually a genocide going on or not. And that could just be shadows on the projections on the in the cave, right?
Yeah,
um and if there was, are we in a position to stop it or not? There's all sorts of complicated things, and I think I wish we could just trust our leaders to be able to make sense of that for us, because I think it's impossible for us to dig into, as much as I support doing our own research. um, it's just impossible for us to dig into everything that we need to take action on, right? Like, I ideally want to know if I should, as a citizen of a democratic country, if I should be in favor of a particular policy stance or not, or opposed to it. But I just can't make that decision unless I've invested hours and hours into researching that particular um, issue. And I
Yeah.
can't spend those hours on every single policy position. So I'll be abstaining on most things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I will say the only thing is that if you go deep on one sort of topic, it does give you an idea of the possibilities with other sort of topics, so that hopefully it gives you some sort of epistemic humility, and knowing that like it's probably more complicated than like just the what you're being told.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, it's sad that we can't even like determine whether, hey, is this genocide happening or not,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think lay people can be making sense of things that are going on by kind of doing their own research? So let's say, in my mind, like, for something like the pandemic measures that we've had, these are things that, I mean, that's much less like the genocide somewhere far away example. That's like, today, if I want to go to a restaurant, a public official is telling me that I need to have this paper that shows I've had this therapeutic, in order to be able to enter the restaurant. Does this make sense or not, right? Um, so I guess I've set the threshold at the point of, if it's directly affecting my life, I should be doing the research to know if it makes sense and if I'm going to go along with this or not. I at least need to dig in a little bit more than I would just passively go with the flow.
Hmm.
Um, do you have thoughts on how lay people can start navigating this overwhelming amount of information on all these overwhelming number of issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't expect most people to um, sort of dig into a lot of the literature. If they can, that's great. But I think that, okay, like when it came to the pandemic, there were a lot of things where you didn't need to do that to know that there were some seriously odd things going on. Um, but here's the thing, people might not have come across this information, but uh, like the censorship, okay, that's one thing. But also, you know what? This reminds me actually of there was a recent interview where Brett Weinstein sat down with Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin Kisin, who's like
As a
the
comedian, right?
yeah, he has a podcast called Trigonometry, um, where they try to interview people who are like heterodox thinkers and things like that. So Kisin is sort of in that space of, I don't know if you want to call it sense making, or at least just interviewing these people who are just heterodox, right? But so Konstantin Kisin, as far as I understand, like he was always against the mandates, but he hasn't really had any stance on like the vaccine safety, and I think he thinks that they're more or less safe, but he just doesn't think they should be mandated, and that he doesn't have a view on things like ivermectin, right? And Brett Weinstein said to him like, and Kissinger had said like, I'm just not qualified, to talk about these things, which I get. But Weinstein said to him, but you are qualified to like recognize things like corruption, and he referenced this video of Tess Lowry. She's a doctor who has done uh, meta-analyses of ivermectin studies, and she's talking with this researcher Andrew Hill, who, long story short, he was part of this nonprofit and basically was pressured to um, either I think it was either change the conclusion or have somebody else write the part of the conclusion for his meta-analyses for ivermectin, and basically saying that like it didn't work, you know and she caught him on video, like basically admitting this, that like he was pressured to do this, despite believing that, at least at the time, believing that ivermectin worked. So he's caught on video doing this, and meanwhile, the entire media is like sort of making fun of ivermectin and calling it horse dewormer and saying that it has no effect on COVID, right? So this is really strange if you see this, right? It doesn't mean that, oh, you should now believe, just because you see this doesn't mean you believe that, oh, now you believe that ivermectin works, okay? But if you see this, like, you should seriously start questioning like just the information landscape and like, holy shit, this is really corrupt, and what else is corrupt? What else is going on? So there's things like that. There's things like that the public can clearly. You have to look for it though, right? If you come across these kinds of things though, like it tells you a lot, you know. Um, and you may not know what to think, of, like, whether ivermectin works or not, right? Because you're not going to read all those studies. But you should at least have like some sort of, again, epistemic humility, right? Like thinking, hey, maybe there is something to this, and I don't know. Maybe there is something really bad going on. And then similarly, seeing censorship, like that's always a red flag. you know um, when have the censors ever been on the right side, really? Why are they censoring? What are they hiding? So things like that, those are the types of things, like when it, and like things like pharma corruption and the revolving door between our regulators and pharma. Those are things that, sure, anyone in the general public, like, that's something that they can learn about and find out about. So you don't necessarily have to read scientific studies to know that there's something wrong. Maybe you don't
Right.
know exactly what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been thinking about in this context is you do understand people. Like even if you may not understand the details of um, of a scientific paper,
Yeah.
or you may people say like people you can cherry pick any study you want. So sure, maybe you don't exactly know if the study that you're cherry picking that has the conclusions you like is well done or not. But you do know about human psychology, and like you said, you do know about corruption. And one of the patterns that I've been relying on somewhat of course, is not foolproof, but if somebody is saying something that is damaging to their livelihood and their reputation, but they're saying it anyway,
Yeah.
you should think that that person has a very strong conviction in the truth of what they're saying, and as opposed to large hordes of lemming like experts that are just echoing exactly the same thing at no risk to themselves, because those people don't have skin in the game,
Yeah.
and the person that's going against the crowd does. Like they're doing something at significant cost to themselves. um, that was also one of my working hypothesis at the moment about the origin of COVID is that it almost certainly came from a lab, because if it hadn't come from a lab, there is no reason for the Chinese state to work as hard as it did to prevent us from knowing where it came from. Um, so that I'm not. I don't need to rely on my expertise in virology or genetics to drive that conclusion. It's just I'm doing it based on the behavior exhibited by authoritarian actors, and I know how authoritarian actors tend to act in situations like this. But that doesn't mean that it's 100% like foolproof theory. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good point about people. I feel like people, uh they forget that. It's almost like common sense, and like people sort of forget it. you know it feels like, when there's like a whole bunch of experts or medical doctors telling you one thing, it's like, you it, it allows them to like lose common sense in a way. Yeah.
yeah, so I think that was most of what I wanted to cover with you today. What are you is there anything that you're that's kind of grabbed your attention recently that you're kind of excited to dig into, or what are you working on these days?
Um, I'm working on an article that I don't know. I could tell you about it, but or I could just like write it and publish it. But it went in a different direction that I had thought. This keeps happening. I don't know. Do you want to hear about it or?
I would love to hear about it if you want to share, or even if you just want to like mention the topic, and
Oh yeah,
excited listeners can subscribe to the Substack and eagerly await
sure.
the
Yeah,
twists and turns.
I'll just mention what it. It's just about the fact that there was a paper that came out earlier this year in Cell, which is a really good journal, by the way, or at least has a good reputation, um, showing that there were some people who had the COVID mRNA vaccine still in their in the lymph nodes, actually, 2 months post vaccination, which is pretty weird. I hadn't expected that, um, and it's about that. I'll just say that, yeah.
Okay,
But it went in some unexpected directions, but we'll see where it goes.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be eagerly awaiting um, that article. Do you have a ETA for when it's gonna be ready to come out?
Uh, maybe next
Putting
week.
you on the spot here.
I hope next week. Yeah, yeah. I thought it would be done a lot quicker, but then, like I said, it went in a different direction, and then you go down a rabbit hole, and you discover this other rabbit hole, and you're like, "Oh man, I hadn't expected this." So
Right.
that's all I'll say. But maybe next week, I hope. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, everyone listening to this can head over to joomi.substack.com and subscribe, and then get the update when it comes out next week.
Okay.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me to talk about our epistemic crisis, and
Thank you
hopefully,
for
hopefully
having
we
me.
can help people make sense of it a little bit.
I don't know. I hope. Thank you.
Yeah. Talk to you soon.
Bye.